The final Eisenhower action that I will mention, and I don't get me started in this because I can name a lot more, but the one that has been overlooked and is of great significance is in 1959, Eisenhower was talked into a program by the majority leader of the Senate, a gentleman named Lyndon Johnson, and the Speaker of the House, Sam Rayburn, both of whom were from Texas, and both of whom felt that the oil industry ought to be protected. So they were able to convince Eisenhower that the growing specter of imports from the Middle East was so dangerous that the United States needed to put quotas on oil imports. And so Eisenhower signed off on an executive order under a law that had been passed by Johnson and Rayburn, setting a quota on foreign oil imports at 12%. Now, as currently we're importing 60%, so to give you some frame of reference. And the way it was set up, there were preferences for Canada and the West Coast, which meant, in effect, that we had outlawed any importation of oil from the Middle East. And we had put severe restrictions on Venezuela, which up to that point had been a pretty consistent ally of the United States, although they were still allowed to import some oil. The next year, there was a meeting I think it was in Baghdad, in the Persian Gulf, and 7 nations got together and formed a group called the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. And they were upset because they felt they were getting jerked around on the world oil market, and they were getting less prices. They couldn't import oil to the United States. And at an early meeting, they adopted a policy that they would nationalize all the Western oil companies doing business in their nations. And it took them about 11 or 12 years to get around to it. We never thought they would actually do it, but they did. And it changed the face of the world, because instead of having private oil companies aggressively looking for oil in the OPEC countries, you end up with state-owned oil companies that do not aggressively look for oil in their nations. A very major change in world history. No one, if you did a poll of American people, even of energy experts, I doubt 1/10 of 1% would remember that we had quotas on Middle Eastern oil imports, and few people would know the history of OPEC, and yet much of the world we live in today is governed by these decisions. If I were evaluating Eisenhower, I certainly believe that we're in a position where we need nuclear power. Some people may disagree with that, but I don't think you can solve the climate change problem without it. So in that sense, I think Eisenhower gets high marks. But on the issue to ban the trade from the Middle East, it sent a message to the Middle East that we really don't believe in these free markets that we're talking about. And it did come back to bite us down the road, although when it did, I don't think anybody ever particularly blamed Eisenhower, president I admire. Now, I'm not picking presidents totally at random, and since I'm in Grand Rapids, I'll talk about President Ford. I was amazed as I poured through the Ford archives that when Gerald Ford became president, he put his top priority on energy. He announced that he was putting a freeze on government spending because he was worried about the imbalance in the federal budget, but he said there's one exception, and that's energy, because we just had this Arab oil embargo in 1973. Incidentally, tomorrow is the 35th anniversary of the beginning of the Arab oil embargo, for those of you who keep track of anniversaries. So this is very timely. But he knew that this was a threat to the country. It was a threat to our economy. It was a threat to our security. When I would read through the minutes of the cabinet meetings, the dominant subject of almost every cabinet meeting was energy. What are we going to do about energy? He would have numerous long 5-6 hour meetings with Bill Simon and Donald Rumsfeld and Alan Greenspan, Frank Zarb, arguing about energy, and they would dig into it. And he would go on frequent nighttime primetime television to talk about energy with the American people. That has almost been forgotten. There is so much been written about the Watergate pardon. Most historians now feel that that was a very appropriate thing to do. But it has dwarfed all the other issues that don't get attention. Then, in 1975, the Congress passed the Energy Policy and Conservation Act, which I would argue is probably the greatest energy package of history. And it contained the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. This was the idea that we would set aside a big block of crude oil and store it in case we were ever shut off again. And today we have 700 million barrels of oil in storage in Louisiana available for emergencies. It also put into place the first mileage efficiency standards for automobiles. It raised the standard. The cars then were getting about 14 miles per gallon, and required by 1985 they get 27.5 miles per gallon, basically doubling the efficiency. That actually didn't happen until '88. And this was a little tough for President Ford because he was from Michigan, and he was personal friends with the CEOs of the auto companies. The auto companies preferred for that not to pass, but they didn't dig in their heels as you might think they would. And so that was passed into law, these mandatory standards, which ended up playing a major role in weaning us off of foreign oil. And it also contained a lot of other fine things. President Ford did not like the fact that it continued price controls as late as 24 hours before he made up his mind. They were drafting speeches for a veto of the bill, but he signed the bill with some mixed feelings. It got very little credit at the time, but again, looking back, it's had a great impact. But if you talk today, you talk to people in the Carter administration, they say, well, Jimmy Carter passed the mileage efficiency standards. It's not true. It happened under Gerald Ford. I don't think people remember at all who created the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. It was Gerald Ford. So we have to be careful when we do our history to go back and look at what really happened. The rap on Carter is that Carter had such bad relations with Congress that he never got anything passed. But he got a major package of bills on energy passed in 1978. In 1979, he put solar panels on the roof of the White House, decontrolled oil prices, phased out, something that Reagan finished. And then in 1980, passed another package of bills. So we had the 75 package, the 78 package, and the 1980 package. Well, what happened? From 1977 to 1982, we chopped our oil imports in half. We were importing 8.6 million barrels of oil. We got down to 43. In percentage terms, we went from 47% imported oil to 28%. And we never got back to 47% until Clinton's second term. So what you read in the paper, you read in the books, you read everywhere, it says we didn't pay any attention to this problem and it just kept getting worse. The fact of the matter is it got a lot better, and then what happened? When we solved the problem, prices went down, we were under no threat of embargo, and we got complacent. And I put a great emphasis on the term complacency in my book. And now that I saw stations today for $2.99, and people here tonight told me they saw it for $2.89, we may be on the verge of another area of energy complacency. And it gets, one of the ways I try to explain this is that I go back to the biblical story of Joseph for you biblical scholars. Joseph, as you remember, had a dream. And he was told to go warn the Pharaoh that a famine was coming. And so what they did was they took the 7 years of plenty, and when the grain harvest was good, they would store the extra grain so it was available during the famine. Joseph would have made a great commodities trader since he had all this inside information, but it worked out very well. Now here's my analogy. In today's energy world, we're going to try to fill the grain bin during the famine, because it's only during the famine that we're paying attention.